Thanks, Lascan. I want to start by just, totally agreeing with my colleague here beside me, with Deputy Connolly, that even the title of this debate is shameful. It's shameful for the Oireachtas and for the country, and particularly for you, Minister, and for the Senior Minister, that we have a debate about, and I quote, supporting children out of emergency accommodation. I mean, children shouldn't be in emergency accommodation in the first place, or if it became absolutely essential, they should be the next day immediately rehoused into permanent secure accommodation. I noticed, for example, in the UK and England, there's a 6-week time limit on homeless families being kept in unsuitable temporary accommodation, like hotels and B&Bs, and even in Scotland, under the Scottish Government, there's a 7-day time limit. But, Minister, babies are being born into homelessness now. Focus Ireland reported, of course, at the launch of its Christmas appeal, that 140 babies of families they're working with were born into homelessness, and deputies, of course, come across this week in, week out. And Focus Ireland has also seen an increase in the number of families they've helped, but say that only 9% of the children they work with have a child support worker, and that's an issue I've raised many times with Deputy Sapone. But as colleagues have said, at the end of September, they're the last figures, of course, we have, Minister, with 3,873 children being kept in emergency accommodation, and of course almost 3,000 of those were in Dublin. Many colleagues have quoted from the Royal College of Physicians about the shocking impacts of homelessness on children. We've all seen it, because we've had children sitting in front of us in offices and so on, where we meet our constituents, and they're literally very fearful and shaking at the prospect of losing their homes. And you must know that, Minister, and yet you have failed to take the requisite action. And we've known it for many years. The European Observatory on Homelessness, for example, refers to the shocking lack of privacy, the lack of space for children, nowhere to bring home friends, and most important of all, the stigmatisation that children suffer, because children have to go to school from homeless accommodation. That's increasingly prevalent in my own constituency. So you're going to school from homeless accommodation, and this puts an incredible burden on these children at primary and at second level. But something obviously the government, just because of their ideological background, have simply failed to address. FANSA, the European Federation, of course, of national organisations working with the homelessness, 15 years ago, long before this government, they defined child homelessness as the most extreme form of child poverty, and that in fact is what it is, or as Deputy Boyd Barrett rightly said, a form of child abuse being practised by this government, and by the way, Minister, for which you may be held accountable many years after this government has ended. And when we look across the European Union, of course, we see the situation that has been allowed to develop in Ireland. It's among the worst examples of family homelessness in the 28 countries. The most recent study, I think, from the European Observatory on Homelessness at the end of 2017 found several countries, such as Denmark and Portugal, where there were very low numbers of homeless families with children, and if they were homeless, it was only for a very brief period. Even states like North Rhine-Westphalia and Flanders showed proportionally how much more the levels of child and family homelessness are in this country. Sweden, of course, has no long-term homeless families, because families are found long-term accommodation almost immediately, and we know the situation of the policy, which I think you referred to yourself in the past, Minister, of Housing First in Finland, where where the government simply won't allow people to become homeless and takes direct action and creates the social housing necessary to do this. And of course, the country, of course, that we resemble most and constantly copy is the United Kingdom, and we have allowed their model of a disastrous housing market after 9 appalling austerity years under the rotten Tory government. It was a model, of course, for the disgraceful conditions which you and your colleagues have allowed to happen in this country. And yet our GDP, of course, I think is the second highest of all 28 countries, even when you count it as GDI star. We're among the richest countries in Europe, and yet you've allowed 4,000 of our children, and several thousands now who have found some permanent accommodation over the last 3 or 4 years. You've allowed allowed them to go into emergency accommodation and to stay there. And of course, you base the bulk of your solutions, as you call them, your housing solutions, on the housing assistance programme. I mean, when you look at the delivery, of course, by local authorities of social housing, my own two counties, which is Dublin City and Fingal, the delivery down to 2018 has been desperate. I mean, snail-like, and an appalling record. I want to commend our colleagues who are on the Housing Committee and are on the Children's Committee for the general recommendations. Most of the recommendations that that people have referred to are most things that we would like to see. For example, the right to housing in the Constitution. We have a bill, our group, in front of the Dáil on that very point. Also, the recommendation 4 of the Housing Committee that there's a statutory duty on housing authorities to regard the best interests of the child as absolutely paramount. But most of the key recommendations in the two committees' reports, they're worthwhile. But I think, Minister, you've no intention of implementing them, and that's the problem. But hopefully, in the general election, we will significantly address this matter. Thanks.